The Federated States of Micronesia has called on Solomon Islands to reconsider its plans for a controversial security treaty with China, becoming the first Pacific country to voice its opposition to the deepening of ties. Key points. Solomon Islands says the draft security agreement will be cleaned up before being signed. Solomon Islands says the draft security agreement will be cleaned up before being signed. Australia, New Zealand and the US have raised concerns the deal could lead to China establishing a Pacific military base. Australia, New Zealand and the US have raised concerns the deal could lead to China establishing a Pacific military base. Other regional leaders are expected to express their concerns over the arrangement. The treaty would put the Pacific at the center of a geopolitical conflict between China and the US, FSM President David Panuelo warned. The US and China are increasingly at odds with one another, Mr. Panuelo wrote in a letter to Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare. This presents an issue because the Federated States of Micronesia is a friend to the people and government of China, but we are also a sincere friend, even an ally, of the people and government of the United States of America. FSM had grave security concerns about the unprecedented agreement, Mr. Panuelo said, as he noted further fears about what the larger countries are privately preparing for. Is it within the realm of plausibility that, as more Pacific islands seek security arrangements with larger countries, that we could see a sovereign and peaceful Pacific become fragmented and become tools for these larger countries' spheres of power and influence, Mr. Panuelo wrote. Isn't it plausible that our islands could become collateral damage once again, such as we saw occur in Guadalcanal in your country, and Chuuk in my country, during World War II? The draft document, leaked last week, specifically provided a framework for Chinese forces to come to Solomon Islands to protect the safety of Chinese personnel and major projects, as well as preserve social order. The draft agreement will be cleaned up before being signed by the foreign ministers of Solomon Islands and China, the Office of the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands said in a statement released on Thursday. Solomon Islands reiterate that the framework of cooperation is to respond to Solomon Islands' soft and hard domestic threats, the statement said. Solomon Islands continue to roll out the implementation of its national security strategy and uphold its foreign policy of friends to all and enemies to none. The country will work with all partners in providing a safe and secure nation where all people are able to coexist peacefully. Other regional leaders will weigh in. Australia's Minister for the Pacific said the government didn't want China coming into the Pacific's security environment. Australia, New Zealand, and the US have raised concerns that the treaty gives China military access to the Pacific and could lead to it establishing a military base in Solomon Islands. Mr. Sogavare said he had spoken with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, saying while his country's traditional security partners were always important, Solomon Islands needed to diversify its partners to achieve our security needs. Mr. Sogavare declared that there were no plans to allow China to build a naval or military base in his country, saying the suggestion was misinformation. We are not pressured in any way by our new friends, he said. Mr. Morrison did not directly criticize Solomon Islands for pursuing the agreement, but Australia's Minister for the Pacific, Zed Seselja, was more forceful. He said Australia did not want to see an authoritarian regime coming into the Pacific's security environment, and predicted significant pushback from other Pacific Island nations. Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has suggested China may want a naval base in Solomon Islands to intimidate Australia. James Batley, Australia's former High Commissioner to Solomon Islands and a research fellow at ANU, told the ABC it was a bit surprising for the Solomon Islands government to claim they hadn't anticipated such a strong reaction. Perhaps the Prime Minister did not get good advice, because I think the sorts of reactions that we are seeing would or should have been entirely predictable, he said. Mr. Batley said he expected other regional leaders to weigh in. It may be just the first of similar sorts of messages that he and Mr. Sogavare receives, he said.